Hi everyone, I'm Naina Prakash. I'm a DPhil student here at the OII, and everyone online and in the room, welcome to We Need to Talk About Misogynoir, Detecting and Preventing Online Abuse Against Black Women. So we're really delighted today to have Dr. Julia Slipsky, who's a OII alumnus herself, and Mutale Nkonde today with us today to discuss the prevalence of digital misogynoir online, documenting the continued use of toxic tropes to silence and harm Black women, as well as the connections between misogynoir and broader structures like white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and conspiracy theories like Great Replacement theory. So just a couple of introductions before we begin. Dr. Julia Slipsky is the head of policy, research and campaigns at Glitch, the maternity cover. Prior to joining Glitch, she completed a PhD in cybersecurity at the Oxford Internet Institute. Her research focused on online safety in the context of intimate partner violence and coercive control. And as a part of this research, she co-founded Reconfigure, which is a feminist research collective which organized digital security workshops with groups like survivors of image-based sexual abuse, environmental activists, and migrant domestic workers. And we're also delighted to have Mutale Nkonde today with us. She's a US-based AI policy advisor who's focused on integrating critical approaches to AI policy formation within the UN. AI for the People, launched by leading the advocacy for the introduction of the Algorithmic Accountability Act, the US House of Representatives. Its language around integrating impact assessments into the product design process was integrated into the American Data Privacy Act of 2022. So what we're thinking today is that the presentation should run for about 40 minutes, followed by a discussion at the end. If you're joining us online, feel free to put your questions into the Q&A box, and those in the room, please save your questions till the end. And obviously, as hopefully we can be respectful and sensitive around the questions that we asked today and the discussion that we have as well. And crucially, for your awareness, this event is being recorded and will be posted on our website following the event. So it's great to have you here, Julia and Mutale, and I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Diana, and thank you all for coming today. So yes, my name is Julia. I'm the head of policy campaigns and research at Glitch, which is an organization committed to ending online abuse and particularly focusing on Black women and Black women's experiences online. And as Diana said, before that, I was doing a PhD at the OII. And with that in mind, I think what might be particularly interesting to you in the room, and I think Mutale will pick this up as well, is thinking about the range of research and advocacy that happens outside of academia and the ways that that's different to academic research and academic papers. So I'm going to be presenting today on a report that Glitch published earlier this year called the Digital Misogynoir Report. And Mutale is going to be talking about a series of reports aimed specifically at the UN. And so thinking about the different ways that research that is more policy oriented and more focused on creating impact and change, specifically in this case, change on the problem of online abuse against Black women. Yeah, I guess the ways in which that's different to academic research. So before I begin, I think okay. Yeah. So I'm going to be running through the background and motivation of this report, the method and findings, and particularly importantly, I think the calls to action in the report. But before I begin, I wanted to start with a disclaimer and a content warning. Obviously, this topic will cover issues of racism and sexism and online harassment, including discussions of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. I think at Glitch, we try to take it very seriously to be trauma-informed. As a part of that, we're not going to be showing screenshots of the abuse that we covered in this report. That's something you can see in the appendices of the report if you're interested. But we will still be discussing this in kind of a non-graphic way. And I think also wanted to particularly acknowledge the ongoing violence in Israel and Palestine and the way that that might be affecting people in the room, as obviously it touches and has also been accompanied by a rise in online abuse around that. But yeah, generally, I think just take care of yourself. It's absolutely okay to leave the room or online at any point if you want to. And I think lastly, as another kind of disclaimer, obviously I'm a white woman communicating on online harms that disproportionately affect Black women. I try to approach that with an understanding that I'm not going to fully understand the lived experience of that, but also that the work of communicating those harms and their seriousness shouldn't fall only or disproportionately on the people who most experience those harms, in this case, Black women. So I think in terms of moving on to the report, we focus on digital misogynoir, which is a relatively recent term coined by Dr. Moya Bailey in 2010. And she uses it to refer to the particular venom directed at Black women due to their gender and race. So it's something that is specifically different to just a mix of racism and sexism. And in the report, we focus on digital misogynoir, which is the continued, unchecked, and often violent dehumanization of Black women on social media. And this can take a lot of different forms, such as algorithmic discrimination, but we focus specifically on text-based abuse on social media. And this is an issue, misogynoir, which Black women have been raising the alarm on for decades. The term digital misogynoir is relatively new, but this is grounded in discussions of misogynoir that have been, of intersectionality that have been going on since the 19th century. And existing research highlights how serious and harmful digital misogynoir online is, and also its link to offline violence, including multiple cases of online hateful rhetoric linked to violence like mass shootings, which is offline. But despite the kind of seriousness of this issue, despite how long people have been raising the alarm on it, the vast majority of research and policy work, both in academia and outside of academia, continues to ignore these kinds of intersections. A lot of existing research doesn't think about people's identities and how they're attacked online at all. Where it does come up, it often focuses only on gender in a kind of single factor analysis, which ends up sort of replacing all women's experiences and flattening it to often just like a white middle-class woman's experience. And I think research that focuses specifically on intersectionality, that focuses on specifically Black women's experiences, is relatively rare and difficult to fund. So I think Glitch as an organization, when we were fundraising for this research, we often got feedback that this is like too much of a niche issue. Despite all of these harms, there is a small and I think incredibly important evidence base on specifically the intersectional nature of online harm. So obviously Dr. Moya Bailey's work, which very much inspired our research on this, looking at Black women's resistance online, Dr. Kishana Gray, who looks at Black gamers and experiences of Black gaming online. Amnesty International did a report on Twitter and found that Black women were 84% more likely to receive online abuse than white women. And Joseph Kwarteng at Open University is developing computational methods for detecting misogynoir. So in terms of the methodology used, and I'll get to it in a second, we did a large-scale quantitative study of the internet. And I think as a qualitative researcher myself, I think I had initially kind of reluctance to this. But I think one thing that's interesting in this that I learned actually is the benefits of large data studies in policy work, where I think maybe there's a lot of work also to be done in challenging the primacy of these kinds of evidence. But when making arguments to regulators, to politicians, like what is perceived as hard data and statistics is incredibly important for getting the point across. And like that is an incredibly important goal in this context. And it's also important because people shouldn't have to keep retelling stories of their trauma and experiences online for it to be taken seriously. It's important to build up this evidence base so that people who experience these harms aren't constantly put on the spot of sharing those experiences. So in terms of the methods we actually used, we partnered with a text analytics company called TextGain. And we scraped almost 1 million messages over 6 months from July 2022 to January 2023. From 5 different social media platforms. So Twitter, the 2 Meta companies, 2 Meta platforms, 4chan and Gab. And we scraped data using a keyword search. So we had a list of neutral terms and toxic kind of slurs related to both Black women, white women, and women in general to create a comparison. And TextGain have an automated toxicity detection algorithm, which uses a lexicon, which is a large dictionary with thousands of terms that they kind of keep updated based on ongoing monitoring of hate speech on platforms in a variety of languages, although this study is only based on English. And the way that works is that human annotators will assign toxicity scores to specific words. These are people with expertise in hate speech. And then that allows you to kind of estimate levels of toxicity according to different categories, platforms, time periods, and so forth. We also use topic modeling to identify underlying themes in the data set. We had a series of community reviewers, including Matale, Nanny Jensen, and Bakita Casada, who kind of helped feedback on the analysis. So we had 3 key findings in this research. Firstly, misogynoir and misogyny were highly prevalent across all of the social media platforms we studied. Secondly, hateful tropes continue to be used to silence and harm Black women online, but also social media canon is used by and for Black women to challenge abuse and to build community. And lastly, misogynoir is connected to and underpins broader hateful narratives like white supremacy, anti-Semitism, Great Replacement theory, transphobia. We ended up picking up a lot of data that wasn't only linked to misogynoir. So firstly, of the almost 1 million posts that we collected, over 200,000, so over a fifth, were incredibly toxic as classified by the algorithm. And in general, compared to like a baseline sample of random data, any mention of women, and particularly Black women, is just a lot more toxic online. And what we think this points to is that these companies have made an active choice to scale up massively to allow for more and more people to post, to allow for algorithms which also push up more controversial posts to our attention without putting effective safety measures in place. And so consistently putting profits over people. We did do a comparison of toxicity of messages according to platform. And I think this is, I think that's one of the contributions of the work, so you don't see a lot of cross-platform research of this kind. But it is also tricky, and I think we shouldn't put too much onto this as a comparison. It's not representative because a lot of what this is reflecting is differences in APIs across the platform. So differences in how much data each platform allows. So for example, we had by far of the mainstream platforms, we had a lot more toxicity on Twitter than the Meta platforms, but that probably has a lot to do with the fact that Meta doesn't allow, doesn't release data from private groups where there's probably much higher levels of the most toxic speech. And likewise, at the time that we collected this data, Twitter had one of the most generous APIs. We actually wouldn't be able to do this kind of research if we started this research now or a few months ago, because Twitter has really shut down its API. And then, unsurprisingly, by far the most toxic platforms were 4chan and Gab, which again is not surprising as they're known kind of havens for white supremacist discourse online. So moving on to a kind of more qualitative analysis of what the nature of online abuse against Black women is, we found over 9,000 more highly toxic posts related to Black women than to white women. And in the topic modeling, we picked up on themes which are closely related to tropes which have been criticized within Black feminist theory for decades. So tropes such as the angry Black woman, the Jezebel, which has to do with fetishization, or the trope of the mammy, were coming up a lot in this data set. But at the same time, the data set also shows a lot of like the power of the joy and positivity of Black women posting about Black women. So there was both more highly toxic and very positive messages about Black women than about white women, which I think is quite like a joyful finding in the midst of what was otherwise a really dark data set and dark piece of research. And I think with specifically the tropes, obviously this is an area where I think it's particularly important to speak sensitively, and there's a content warning involved. But by far the most prevalent trope was that of the angry Black woman, which is also one that is particularly harmful because it's used to silence Black women when they speak out on issues related to them, such as misogynoir. And then lastly, we, in this research, found that misogynoir was connected to a lot of broader narratives like white supremacy and Great Replacement theory. So as I said, we were collecting data specifically about women, Black women, white women, and slurs related to those groups. But we picked up a lot of other forms of hate with the toxicity detection algorithm. Things like homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism were very mixed in. We found that different forms of online hate are incredibly interlinked and reinforcing of each other. So I think it's possible to kind of go into these spaces with a specific grudge or grievance towards one group and then be inundated with a lot of content that's really hateful towards different marginalized groups. This did differ across different platforms. So on mainstream media, there's mostly things like stereotyping, body shaming, fatphobia, fetishizing, while the alternative platforms had these much more specific extreme forms of white supremacy and anti-Semitism. I think a really good illustration of this is something that came up a lot in the sample, which is great replacement theory, which is a white nationalist far-right theory that originates in France, but has been increasingly popular online across the kind of global minority Western world. And it maintains that white European populations are being demographically and culturally replaced with non-white people, particularly from Muslim majority countries, through mass migration, demographic growth, and a drop in birth rate from white Europeans. So obviously this is a conspiracy theory that's overtly racist, overtly Islamophobic. But I think it also illustrates how tied up different forms of oppression can be, because there's often very misogynist undertones to this. It's very obsessed with controlling women's bodies. In fact, a lot of the hate towards white women that we found in the sample set was based on demeaning white women in mixed race couples who are seen as betraying the white race. And these kinds of theories will often have overt or covert elements of anti-Semitism, talking about sort of replacist elites, which again are betraying the white race, which is often a wolf whistle for anti-Semitism. And I think one specifically interesting finding in the research is the ways that specific terms, conspiracy theories, jargon from these very alt-right platforms like Gab and 4chan do migrate back onto mainstream platforms. So this chart shows the use of specific phrases that are common on Gab and 4chan and their increase in Twitter over time from 2017. I think we often talk about people who are particularly hateful or banned being removed from Twitter or removed from Facebook and then finding like-minded people in these platforms. So I think it's important also to note that particularly hateful ideas or memes will make their way back onto mainstream platforms where they are not content moderated and where they reach far larger audiences and have a lot more harm and damage than they would be able to on these smaller alternative platforms. Yes, so I think there's a lot of limitations to this work. I think there's a lot of areas where there needs to be a lot more work done. The data set was limited in that it was English language only, which unfortunately recreates a pattern in a lot of the online hate and content moderation space. There's a lot of attention paid to English and far too little attention paid to other languages. So that's a huge area where more research needs to happen and is happening. As I mentioned, there's a lot of issues with data access, hidden groups, a kind of industry-wide clampdown on tools like CrowdTangle, which allow data access. And specifically, we don't really have a full picture of content moderation. So we know from a qualitative analysis that a shocking amount of a subsample were still up when we looked at them a year later, even overtly messages that were probably illegal, not to mention in violation of platform policies. But we don't have data on which messages were removed, why they were removed, how many people saw them before they were removed, and so forth. And also we chose specifically to focus on and center Black women's experiences, but there is still a lot of work to be done about intersections with experiences of other women of color online, overlaps and differences and so forth. There's also, I think, a lot of limitations in the methods that we used for hate speech detection. I think we were recreating with very limited resources the kind of hate speech algorithms that social media companies have, which have a lot more complexity and data and computational power behind them. So we were looking only at text-based abuse. I think we actually were able to account for emoji in some instances, but definitely not pictures or video. I think automated tools like the ones we're using can include inbuilt bias. The annotation team were predominantly white, and so they may have missed a lot of the nuances that people with lived experience may have. On the flip side, I think engaging with a lot of this content when it is personally targeting you can be really traumatizing. So there's also benefits to not having that. And with all of these kinds of algorithms, there is the issue of consistently distinguishing between the content itself and counter speech. So content that discusses or responds or critiques or subverts hate speech itself. We've got specific numbers on accuracy tests in the report, but we did see roughly equal rates of false positives and false negatives, which means for posts that we weren't detecting as hate speech, there are also other posts that we wrongly were. Okay, so moving on to the calls to action. So we argue as an organization that everyone can and should be doing, should be responding to digital misogynoir in their various personal and professional lives. Specifically in the report, we break things down for tech companies, for governments, for research and civil society, and for communities. For example, for tech companies, we ask them to have definitions and policies on misogyny, on white supremacy, on misogynoir. This is something that we're actively kind of in conversation with tech companies about. We want to see transparency reports with data disaggregated by race and sex and so forth, and removing the kinds of barriers to data asset access that I was discussing, having well-funded trust and safety councils. With governments, we do advocacy work around wanting them to adopt a public health approach that's preventative rather than punitive and criminalizing. We want to see explicit recognition of intersectionality in legislation on online safety, and generally more to hold tech companies accountable, like through a specific tech tax on companies. I guess for research and civil society, which might be particularly relevant to people in the room, I think it's incredibly important to work together across sectors, and to not get siloed into, digital rights, anti-racism, feminism, in kind of separate tracks. I think the extent to which this hate online is extremely interrelated means that the response to it also needs to be really collaborative and interconnected. I think it's incredibly important to focus on languages other than English, as I've said, and to fund research by, for, and about Black women, and pen Black women in these spaces. So I think there's a lot here around funding and what kind of work gets funded and doesn't get funded. And then we also have these broader recommendations for online communities, online digital citizens, that are particularly, I think, about following and listening to Black women, petitioning tech companies, and understanding these issues, being able to call them out. So we talk about at Glitch about online active bystander intervention, so behaving responsibly online, calling things out and intervening, supporting people when they're experiencing abuse. And also kind of digital self-care, so setting and communicating boundaries for yourself, to try to make online spaces and experiences more positive and respectful for both yourself and others. And I'm happy to talk more about any part of that, or any part of these calls to action. I'm going to hand over to Mitali now, and if you want to see the report, it is here.
For people that work on the internet can't use the internet. Hi, my name is Mitali Conde. I lead AI for the People. I grew up in the UK, but I've lived in the United States for almost 20 years, and I am a policy fellow here, and this is the first time I'm in Oxford. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes just talking about grey research and how we use research findings to influence and move power towards justice, whether we're thinking about a governmental setting, whether we're thinking about a company setting, or whether we're thinking about multinationals. And I'm happy to speak about why we look at those key intervention points. Oh, do I point? That's it.
Is that gone?
Okay. Yeah. So, quick introduction. I came to the party, as it were, through Gray Research. This is a report called Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech. I'm going to go through the framework later, but this was written in 2019 while I was a fellow, first at Data and Society and then at Harvard. And it was it was pure frustration to speaking to policymakers, speaking to people in companies, and them really looking for ways for engineers to detect what would be considered race or racism within their engineering processes. This is a key difference to the United States. That report fell into the hands of big philanthropy. We have a whole sector that at that time was making strategic investments into groups that were looking critically at tech. And then we're able to fund our work for the first 3 years, which I think is a little different to the UK. I don't know that you can have an idea, write a report, and then somebody give you a check to pursue that, but that's what happened. So I do live in New York City, so nothing is real if capitalism does not recognize it. So we were delighted when NASDAQ, which IPOs many companies in the startup space, recognized us as a group that were looking to change the way in which tech is thought about and tech is developed. I had no idea my face would be on a building when I sent them the picture, but it happened. So capitalism says I'm a thing. And because of that, do advisory work. And this goes back to direct intervention at the algorithmic level with TikTok, and been a Google partner for a really long time. And that becomes key as we think about not just misogynoir and content moderation, but we think about responsible AI or ethical AI as a field writ large. Being able to speak to these teams directly at the vice president or above level has been an incredible strategy for us. So again, I talked about how Gray Research, outside of academia, we would think of it as thought leadership, had really enabled us to do the work that we do. And myself, one of my mentors, Jessie Daniels, who I believed has some connection to OAI, like I think that she's mentored some PhD students doing work on online white supremacy. And computer science professor Berkshire Mayer over at Bucknell did this report using a literacy framework to help people learn to think about race. So the first thing that we posited was that racist algorithmic decisions sit within a wider social structure. So this idea, we were writing this in 17, 18, we published in 19. And at the time, people really did not believe that algorithms could have politics, which is really sad, because if you go into other fields, you will find that things like bridges, things like where we go to school, how we go to school, all of these are political decisions. But at that time, people were trying to convince us that engineering practices were mathematics. And because we were not engineers, we did not understand engineering. So we did not believe that. The next thing was that this discussion that algorithms had politics, and those politics could be racist, sexist, ableist, pick your poison, really set off emotional triggers. So as we were interviewing, and we were interviewing at the VP level, and we were looking at, we had one set who were VPs of engineers in major companies. We had another set who were a bunch of social science researchers. So that was, you can imagine their responses. Then we had like general people in tech firms. And we found that even in all of these three things, there was an emotional reaction to talking about race, and that was acting as a barrier for us to even ask our questions. So within the literacy framework, one of the things that we advised was that there had to be strategies to get past the emotional. I think Julia did a great work with trigger warnings as an example. But another strategy that we used was as we got much deeper into our questioning, I questioned all the Black people, my colleague Jessie questioned all the white people, and then we swapped and we questioned them, and then we compared the differences. So all the white people told me that they had voted for President Obama in this particular exercise, and I never asked them. None of them told Jessie that. They also told me that they like Black people in my hair. Completely irrelevant, never asked. So the next thing that when we're thinking about literacy, and this is where I think there is such a major difference between academic research and action-oriented research, is literally we want something to happen. We were not asking these questions and developing this knowledge to advance a field, even though we did. We were asking these questions because we wanted to reduce harm. So that goes back to this public health framing that I think you so wonderfully put forward. And for us as an organization, we were looking to provide key interventions to key decision makers at the government level. So in my case, I'm a dual citizen, but in this particular case, I was thinking about the US government. And I was just speaking earlier about how the United States isn't a real country anymore. It's just land and people and guns, I don't know. But at that time, Paul Ryan, who none of you know or need to know, was the Speaker of the House, which is like the House of Commons. Basically does not believe in racism, does not believe in women, nothing going on. Mitch McConnell was in the equivalent of the Lords, same thing. And President Trump was actual president. So there was no influencing that government, still no influencing that government. We really did find intervention points in industry, which we didn't expect. This was also a time that much of the social science research coming out about platforms was incredibly confrontational. And because we, as an advocacy organization, as a policy organization, we are in the business of making and keeping friends. And so our much softer approach gave us an incredible amount of access that many of our peers, and I'm quite happy to speak about that, but many of our peers in academia weren't given at that time. And then multinational organizations, and this was our big surprise. We were not seeking any type of relationship or to intervene with the UN. But what happened, and this goes back to once capitalism decides you're a thing, what happened was I had presented, I think, a Google summit, and there had been members of the UN there that then started to invite us into processes. And so we're still kind of untangling that, because our entry point wasn't academia and our entry point wasn't civil society, but we've been able to do quite incredible work at the UN level. Because of that, I will say, though, doing anti-racist work at the UN level can be very cagey, because you run into huge amounts of funding from Russia and China. And I've been trying to dodge that. I have enough problems. I can't get into that. So I've spoken a little bit about why we work with the United Nations, but one of the major reasons was because I did grow up here and I do live in the United States and I hold both passports. There was no way for me to speak to the UK at the same time that I'm speaking about or for the United States if it wasn't at the UN level. So one of the ways that we ended up even working with Glitch, I do know Shay, but it was our joint engagement at both the UN level and our joint engagement at company levels that created this pathway. And we're now organizationally, and some of the work that I'm hoping to do here as a policy fellow is think about other ways to create pathways for that type of cross collaboration, but also get it funded. And I have some ideas, but it literally was the only platform. And I think that that's a real shame, and that shouldn't be the case. What brought us to the report was the Amnesty International finding that Black women who were researchers, politicians, or public figures were 84% more likely to be attacked than their white counterpart. And what that really means is that it's the silencing of the Black female voice, which is often a voice from the left. It is often the voice of lived experience. Many of the researchers that come to this type of work on the internet are really coming through a Black feminist framework. So for those that are familiar with Patricia Hill Collins's work, this idea of lived experience and positionality being a form of knowledge production as much as the gathering of the data and the analysis of the data. Shay and I both sit on the TikTok content advisory council, so I know this is being recorded. Hi, TikTok. I'm being careful because we both sit behind NDA. But one of the things that was really interesting was we work globally. We work globally, but we operate locally. So I sit in the US space. She sits in the UK space. But as we were having some of these discussions with our colleagues from the MENA region, from our colleagues, they're starting, thank God, a sub-Saharan African region. As we were thinking about our colleagues from Latin America, it really occurred to us that these problems of sexism online, white supremacy online, misogynoir online are appearing globally, but there are like 7 people speaking about them in 2 countries. So we were really interested in not just the findings, but also being involved in that process. And then, as I mentioned, it was a very real way to think about Anglo-American collaboration, particularly Anglo-American collaboration in this political moment where we have deadlock in both political sides. Congress and the Commons are not stable. So what happens when they're not stable, and what happens to make sure that this work completely continues to go forward because people are still being harmed? Hope for the future. So I've spoken a little bit about, thanks to Mark. Mark and I were joking. We have been speaking to each other for years, and it's happened. So engagement with OAI over the next couple of years, my ambitions are to think about ways of not only doing more creating pathways for more of this type of gray research, so more action-oriented research that crosses the UK and the US, similarities and differences. And then because we've developed this, we've developed a bullhorn. So thinking about places that we have intervention points that maybe are not here and vice versa. And making sure OAI get much more into some of the meetings I'm in, because there is, I'm thinking off the top of my head, there's some OAI research that I'm sharing with the City of New York right now around procurement, and making sure the AI systems that are procured by municipalities that are ethical in these ways. That comes from this department, but those voices aren't here. So definitely, Mark, have a lot of work for us. The other thing, my hope for the future is that the real life consequences of online violence are seen, legislated, and regulated as real life consequences. I think Julia did a really good job of this being ignored when it's women, this being ignored when it's Black women. But let's be clear, this is all feminized people. All feminized people. So you don't have to be a feminized person to have a vested interest in feminized people being safe online. So bringing that forward. And then for me, so it is hilarious that I'm saying this out loud to be recorded, but when I got my undergraduate degree, I basically was like, bye, see ya, never coming back here. And I'm now applying for PhD programs because gray research cannot happen without academic basis. And one of the things that I'm running into is that there is not enough work being done in the academy that enables this jumping off point for advocacy, for policy, for integration into the mainstream. And I am somebody that really does believe in expertise, and empirical research is really important. I'm a social scientist, so I'm always going to say social science is the most important empirical research, but we need it across the board. And my call to action, and even coming today, is to invite you all into that process, because the thing I fear is that the data sets that we're using are aging. that 84% figure that I've quoted is from 2018. I would love to know what that looks like with the huge number of elections we have coming up in 2024. And even, I can think about Google as an example. One of the projects that we worked on was the recognition of Black skin by biometric systems. And it was so funny coming through. I actually got on this morning, I took an overnight flight. Sounds crazy to people in the UK, but in the US, we do this all the time. Like, we get on a plane, we sleep, we go to meetings, we get off the plane, we sleep after the meeting. This is a normal thing for us. Again, the US isn't a real place, so I can talk about that later. But one of the things that was really interesting when I landed at 6 a.m. this morning in London was that I was presented with a facial recognition system to get through customs. And then I just said, I was like, what's my accuracy rate? And they were like, what are you talking about? And I was like, no, there's a number. And they said, the accuracy rate is 3%. And I said, well, you literally don't know who I am. Like, you were just letting random Black people in here because this thing doesn't work. But okay, you paid for it, whatever. Okay. But high US, no, UK customs high. And so we had looked at that, and we were really looking at this research that had been published in 2008 by Joy Guluemi and Timnit Gebru as the basis. But what now Google has done is that they've developed a new skin detection scale. It's called the Monk scale, with a partnership from Harvard. So that's another really good example of how empirical research in the academy can do incredible good at the policy level in technology. And the detection rates have improved by nearly 80% across skin tone. I will say the inspiration for that piece of research was Fenty Beauty. So if you're not using it, shout out Rihanna, and her ability to match skin tone and foundation. But that also means that piece of research is no longer relevant. So we do need this continual engagement, and I hope to be part of that. And I am extremely excited about being in discussion with you all. And thank you, Mark, for everything that you did to not just get me here, but to get me onto the policy fellowship. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so we're now going to do, yeah, sure. We're now going to do a bit of a Q&A with participants online and in the room. I do have one question here, but would anyone in the room like to raise their hand and ask a question? Yeah, sorry. Yes.
So, hi. So I'm Diyu, and I'm also doing research on online misogyny, but on the Chinese internet. So I just have like one research related question. So when you are doing like the text scraping across social media platforms, do you try to account for like the demographic features of like the accounts behind those like very hateful posts?
Yeah, so we didn't collect data on the people who were posting at all. So I think that's a big limitation. It means it's difficult to track people's motivations for posting. And I think, yeah, I think it'd be an interesting thing to look into, but it's not something that we looked at.
Anyone else in the room? Yep.
Yeah, just thank you both for the talks. It's so interesting to hear. And I think you both mentioned the fact that this is so under-researched at the moment, but it'd be interesting to know like if there are some specific research gaps that you've identified kind of thus far, for specific areas.
So I think what you just said, I think a big actually is perpetrator motivations, like why do people do hate speech online? And I think that's incredibly important. Because it's the route to like prevention and rehabilitation rather than just banning people or criminalizing people. And I think you see that across the board with a lot of violence against women research, that a lot focuses on victims and how to keep them safe, which is incredibly important. But I think trying to focus on perpetrators in a way that's rehabilitative and not criminalizing, I think is a huge area of research from my perspective. What your thoughts are?
I think for us, my personal research interest is the intersection between religious speech and misogyny and the construction of women within those myths. And the reason that that's so important is that white supremacist speech is the basic data set that we have for all large language models, because the first people to adopt the popular internet in 1983 were the Aryan Nation. And they were actively social networking within password protected groups called LibertyNet. They were exchanging information on how to commit crimes. They were, it was dating. So it was things like, to the point that you made around race mixing, it was things like, Jane and Bob are going to be my people for this, but it was like Aryan Jane, who's strong, I don't know, with blonde hair, if you should date John because he's an Aryan, and then they can have the white race, and then they're not going to get replaced, and blah, 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 blah. And I don't think that there is enough research into the ways in which we understand meaning in the Western world, or the acknowledgement that much of that meaning is made out of religious mythology. And certainly living in the United States and watching the Capitol being stormed on January 6th, and then a cross being erected and a prayer session being had, that it's been very difficult for me to shape. And they are also the ones that are banning abortion. And if you looked at that Supreme Court decision, one of it was a white woman actually wrote, the reason that abortion should not be federally protected in the United States was to protect the birth supply of white children. So I'm deep in Eve myths right now.
I think maybe just to also add to that, I think a really important layer of this that we kind of only mentioned but didn't really fully go into in the report is the, like, specifically the prevalence of these kinds of tropes and like deeply embedded oppressive thinking. How much, like, if you think about the sheer quantity of the text on the internet, like how common that is and the effect that has on large language models that are being trained on that, and as those become more influential and more widely used, like how deeply embedded this kind of thinking will then be with the internet as a kind of like data set that's informing that.
And lastly, because I do want to get to other questions, if we think about generatively, what that means for generated text. And I know that there were a number of experiments on ChatGPT-4, and they kept being like, oh my God, it ended up being a Nazi. And I was like, it ran out of things to say. So it went to the base language model, which is the Aryan Nation.
Thanks. Sorry, I have a question online. I'm just going to take that first. Thanks. Dr. Julia's presentation highlighted the challenges automated tools face with image-based hate speech, especially against Black women. As image-based misinformation and memes rise, should advocacy shift towards increasing legal obligations on platforms to overhaul their content moderation approach altogether? Julie, you want to take it first?
Yeah, we could both. Yeah, so that's a really great question, and also another really huge area I think for further research is image-based detection of abuse. Like, we know so much of hate speech will have this like visual component, and we know that visual, like images and video, are used to bypass text-based content moderation, because as flawed as text-based content moderation is, it's still miles ahead of everything that we have for video and images. So yeah, I think absolutely there should be kind of pressure and accountability and transparency and monitoring of how companies are moderating images and video. I think it's something we're looking at Glitch. We're also thinking about deep fakes and generative AI and the role that that's playing in exacerbating abuse. But it poses big challenges, because like having just done this project trying to detect abuse in just text and how challenging that is, I think there's ongoing challenges for doing that content moderation for video.
I would definitely say yes, and I think I would love to be able to be like, yes, there should be, do that thing. The issue is that many of these companies, particularly English language, sit in California and protected by our media laws. So Section 230 of the Communications and Decency Act in the US basically says that platforms are platforms, And anything that goes on the platform, there is no liability for it. It is being developed by a third party. And that was the way that Google was being able to be started. Because if you think about Google in its early stages, if it was drawing from all of this toxic content, it didn't want to get sued. So, and there has been a Supreme Court challenge to that last year, Google versus Gonzalez. And what happened in that particular case was a family lost their daughter to a terrorist attack in Paris, that the ISIS said that they did the attack. The family, in some way, they found out that they'd been watching training videos on YouTube, and the family attempted to argue that online radicalization led to this account because there was not an A to B correlation between the ISIS fighter and the video. That challenge failed. But the interesting thing that came, if you read those decisions, were this idea that the Supreme Court bench are not internet experts. And so they didn't even know what they were looking at. So as much as we're talking about the companies in the question, we need to think about new legal paradigms. Again, going back to this US-UK collaboration, I know that there are professors here, there are legal scholars. We need to think about new legal paradigms, because even in the US context, civil rights law, which is where this might sit, you have to be able to show intent. We don't know how to do that. We also have to think about who are on our benches. So who are our judicial class? And in the US, Trump packed the court with like farmers and like people who want to bring oil back. And that's the whole legal generation who don't know about the internet. And then the other thing in terms of companies is we need to develop a compelling business case for content moderation, because their one goal is to make as much money as possible. And I've been arguing for years that this could be a business asset. I wrote an article for Harvard Business Review in 2019, and nobody believed me at the time, and now they're all booking me to do speaking. But I said that this is actually a way that you could differentiate yourself. And when speaking to policymakers from the US perspective, this is a way that we can differentiate from China, because that's the only argument that they're thinking. This is something that we could do. I know. Listen, them's the breaks. You got to do what you got to do.
Thanks. I'm conscious we have about 5-ish minutes left, so I'll take probably a couple more questions. There is one question online. Calvin, do you want to go?
Yeah, so my name is Calvin. I'm a PhD student here in UII. I do some research on misinformation detection and moderation. I have a question regarding the grid research. So you mentioned something like, I think that refers to action-oriented research. I just want to have a better understanding of this. Does it mean like you already have an idea before conducting empirical research and want to promote some agenda on that? Or you're still doing academic research, but like Foucault, like himself is an activist. He do some activists in his free time, but still do academic research rigorously without any assumptions. So I'm wondering, how does that work? Or is it more like a think tank? We do some non-peer review research, promote the things we believe, then just to connect with more policy organizations.
We personally, I think that those three models do exist. I think AI for the People really like to lean on empirical peer-reviewed research, and then we will create an action plan for that. So in terms of filtering, we are obviously drawn to the academics that are working in the areas of interest. So we're drawn to people like Jesse Daniels, who think about race online and how it shows up. But we don't have a hypothesis. It's things that are in the public domain. The reason I'm interested in pursuing a PhD is that I want to conduct empirical research. I don't know that it's necessarily our place as an organization to do that. We would follow the model that Glitch did, which would be to have a hypothesis partner and then test the hypothesis. Often though, one thing I will say in terms of, and I think you're getting to motivation, is that when you think something is a thing, it usually is a thing. So in that way, like we've never gone down a research road and been like, oh my God, there's no racism. We've never, it's a thing. But we need to be able to have the evidence, and then we're always going to make an argument that is based on creating the most just, the most equitable, and we want to create an internet where people flourish. And so our recommendations are going to be around that, but we will talk about our limitations, and we will think very carefully about how we communicate out.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just want to add one more comment on that. So sometimes it's not a thing. It's considering misinformation, we thought it's really prevalent, but according to empirical data, it's like 60% of online information just misinformation. So it's like, in terms of the absolute amount, it's quite not that significant, but we feel like it's so significant. Yeah, it's just a comment. It's not like,
I mean, I would
feel
love
like
to speak to you more about that. I think I agree with that more than I don't. I think I've seen a lot of research in the misinformation field where they're like, the algorithm made them an extremist. And my position is no, the algorithm didn't make you already believe that. You just got into a filter bubble and like have nothing to do. But we can speak about that.
Probably have time for one quickish question, maybe. Anyone? Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so thank you both for your presentations. I think one thing that's quite interesting to me is how a lot of the solutions tend to be individualized, in the sense that the person who receives the harassment and abuse has to sort of barricade themselves and protect their accounts and security settings. I think also it's quite an interesting design decision for a lot of these platforms that as soon as you join, you can communicate and do whatever you want in any direction. And I was wondering if there's any lessons to be learned from smaller online communities where you have to earn the right to do things on the platform. Not to say that's the solution, but I just find it quite interesting how, well, we understand why platforms want you to do that. It's all about the engagement. But it's interesting when you look at the design decision that says that, yeah, you can just do whatever you want, whenever you want. Is there any lessons to be learned from other communities?
Yeah, definitely. I think content moderation in smaller communities and community norms and I guess restorative justice as it happens is an area that we're very interested in and would love to learn from more. I do think a lot of online safety and security advice falls disproportionately on the person experiencing the harm to protect themselves. Yeah. I think at Glitch, we are trying to shift that burden more onto like broader institutions, like the companies, like the governments and the communities and bystanders, to make it more of a collective responsibility than an individual responsibility. But the question of like what that would mean, because I think also in the report and generally, we very much want to move away from an idea of content moderation as just about removing content and banning people, because I think that doesn't help the underlying motivations for that behavior, and it often doesn't address the victim's needs and what they need. And I think in smaller communities where there is like more human oversight and kind of more care, you have kind of more possibility for responding to abuse in a way that's repairs and restores. But from big companies, what that would potentially involve is like a lot of resource and investment into well-compensated community moderators, which I personally really like as a solution to online abuse problems, but it's so at odds with what companies want to invest in, which is like ever more sophisticated machine learning driven algorithms for detecting this abuse. Did you?
No. Okay. Perfect. Well, that is perfectly on time in that case. Thank you all so much. Maybe you could join me in a round of applause for Matale and Julia.